Great, so we heard 3 talks, and the first 2 talks looked at this question that I posed in the beginning of epistemic parochialism, looking primarily on what happens when the information that children are receiving has to do with the group. And we heard also from Marjorie, now something about also what happens when the speaker has knowledge or doesn't have knowledge about the relevant issue. I want to switch gears a little bit and sort of bring another dimension to this question of the dynamic between rationality and parochialism by looking at who people trust for information, who people look for when they are interested in information, particularly when they're looking for information about groups, about people who belong to groups. So imagine that you hold a belief about an issue, and let's represent this belief as being this red dot. And now imagine that you want to access some sources of information to find out more things about this particular belief about the world. Now, one way you can go about this is by spreading your net and asking for information from many, many different sources, some of them holding that position, some of them not holding your position. Well, if you live anywhere similar to where I live, that's not how people look for information. People end up staking to their echo chambers, and they search for information from sources that most of the time align with their own beliefs. So we watch certain TV channels, we read certain papers, and we go into social media, and we are fed information again that is consistent with our thoughts, with our beliefs. So what we wanted to see is, well, how do children go about looking for information? Again, how do they look for sources of information? Now, we've heard from the talks before and sort of, their introductory reviews that children can access information based on rational strategies, looking basically for epistemic cues. So they will look for experts in a field, and we just heard sort of one example here about, knowledgeable of speakers. They will look for informants who have been proven to be accurate and reliable in the past. They will look for informants who have access to relevant information over those who do not have access to the information. So they can rely on this bunch of epistemic cues. But they can also rely on parochial cues, meaning that they'll trust their mom or dads for information more than other people. They'll trust familiar individuals over unfamiliar individuals, their teachers, for instance, over other teachers. And they will also trust in-group members based on race, on language, and even minimal groups. So what happens when these epistemic and parochial cues clash? So in some cases, we see that when a topic is neutral, and by neutral I mean they have no relevance, again, to the group identity, for instance, then by age 6, it seems that epistemic cues win. So by age 6, and many people have already referred, and we also heard sort of now in the last talk, something happens at age 7, and some, I think it's Mike Tomasello who called it the age of rationality. Something happens there that all of a sudden children are very rational. But they're not that rational, as we have already heard today, when the topic is group related. Then things get a little messy. So in our studies, we ask how children balance between epistemic and parochial cues in their choice of informants, and we wanted to know whether age matters, because as we saw, there is a developmental story apparently there. We wanted to see also whether the group status of the informants and of the children matter. So these studies were done in Israel, so the majority were Jews and the minority were Palestinian Arabs. And we also check whether the topic matters, again, whether it is in-group relevant or neutral, or in other ways also whether it's close to the child in socially or distant from the child socially. So in our first study, we asked whether children have preference for in-group versus out-group informants on non-social matters. So this is kind of a baseline study. We tested 130-something Israeli citizens. Half of them, more or less, were Jews, half of them were Palestinian Arabs. 2 age groups here, kindergartners and second graders. The procedure included 3 trials. Basically, in each trial, children were exposed to a different place that they may want information about. So it could be a park, a mall, or a zoo. And what we varied was the 2 possible informants that children could ask for information about these places. So in one trial, they could ask an in-group informant or a conflict out-group informant. In another trial, they could ask an in-group informant or a neutral out-group informant. I'll explain that in a second. In the third trial, a conflict out-group or a neutral out-group. And the terminology here is that for Jewish participants, the in-group would be a Jewish participant. A conflict out group would be an Arab informant. For Arab participants, an in-group would be, again, the reverse. So the in-group informant is an Arab, and a conflict out group would be a Jew. And for all these kids, a neutral out group would be a Scot. No particular reason why Scot. We have used this in the past, and we know that there is a ranking, really, that children like the Jews most if they're Jewish, and then the Scots, and then the Arabs, and the other way around for Arab children. So again, it's just to see whether this is just, again, an in-group, out-group, or does it have to do also with the emotions attached to and the attitudes that children may have regarding these different kinds of out-groups. So here's an example of a trial. This is a trial in which the informants were either an in-group or a conflict out-group. And I'm going to present here just these two questions that we ask kids, an expertise and a preference question. And I'm not going to, for the sake of time, not go into too much detail about differences here. So in this trial, for instance, we present children a picture like this. So this is a park. Imagine that you're going to the park, and you want information about the park. So here are two boys who can tell you things about the park. Salim, an Arab boy, or Ron, a Jewish boy. So who do you think knows more about the park? So that's an expertise question. And who do you want to tell you and who do you want to tell you what to do in the park? So that's a preference question. So what I'm showing you here is just plotting, for now, just a second, sort of the percentage of choices of the in-group informant in these two kinds of trials. So you have one trial. So you have one trial in which the possibilities were an in-group or a conflict out-group, and the other trial in which the possibilities were an in-group or a neutral out-group. And as you can see here, this is across ages and ethnicities. Children favored the in-group informant over these other two kinds of out-group informants. What we also looked at is whether children have a preference for the neutral out-group in this third kind of trial, and the answer is no. They did not show a preference for the neutral out-group over the conflict out-group, again, on these neutral subjects, on these neutral matters. What happens, though, for children's preferences when the topic is a social topic, when the topic is actually getting information about a person who has a particular social group identity? So again, Jewish and Palestinian Arab kindergartners and second graders. Here the procedure included 5 trials, a little bit more complicated. I'll walk you through. The structure here was the following. So in 2 sets of trials, in 2 trials, the target, that is the person that the child wanted information about, was an in-group member. So for Jews, this would be a Jewish person, and for Arabs, this would be an Arab. And then they had 2 trials that varied in terms of the composition of the possible informants. So in one trial, the informants could be either an in-group member or a conflict out-group member. And in the other trial, the possible informants could be an in-group member or a neutral out-group member. Then children had also 2 trials in which the target was a conflict out-group. And again, they had the possibility of choosing between a conflict out-group or a neutral out-group member, or the conflict out-group and an in-group member. And finally, there was one trial, less interesting for us again, in a sense, in which the target was a neutral out-group, and children could choose between the neutral out-group and the in-group. Now, what's interesting about, again, this structure here of the trials is that on 3 of the trials, the choice that a child should make based on parochial cues and the choice that the child should make based on epistemic cues are the same. So if I want to know something, if the child is an Arab child, and she wants to know about an Arab girl, and she has the possibility of asking an Arab or somebody else, again, the Arab informant knows probably more about an Arab target and is also my in-group member. So in that sense, again, the parochial and the epistemic cues align. In these other 2 trials, they conflict. So for instance, if I'm an Arab child and I want information about a Jew, then the possibility of asking a Jew is sort of the epistemically better choice, because probably a Jewish informant knows more about Jews, but the conflict out group is the one from, the in-group is the one from my group. So in terms of the parochial cue, I should choose the other informant. So here's again an example when we ask for expertise and preference. Imagine that this is Alon, a Jewish boy, and here are 2 boys who can tell you things about Alon. Ron, a Jewish boy, or Salim, an Arab boy. Again, depending on the child, on the participant's ethnicity, this could be, again, a conflict trial. This is a conflict trial, and the choices vary. And again, the same 2 questions. Who do you think knows more about Alon, and who do you want to tell you things about Alon? We also asked here a question having to do with the disposition of the child based on some advice that they might get from these two informants. So here the question on advice was, Salim says that you should invite Alon to go to the park with you. So there's a positive disposition towards this target. Ron says you should not invite Alon to go to the park with you. So this is a negative valenced disposition towards this target. What would you do? Which advice, whose advice would you follow? So, results. I'm going to break out these results based on the question and also based on whether it's an in-group trial or an out-group trial. So this is an in-group target trial, and what you see plotted here on the y-axis is the percentage of children who chose the in-group informant. To summarize here a lot, in a sense, what you can see here is that all the bars are more or less above chance, or only one of them is not strictly above chance, this one here, meaning that, again, across ages, by and large, across ages and ethnicities, children choose an in-group informant to get information about an in-group target. We find that second graders did that more than kindergartners. So you can see that the bars are higher for second graders than for the kindergartners. And we also saw that Arab children, so these are the gray bars, they also chose the in-group informant more than the Jewish informants did. So the Arab participants stuck to their in-group informants more than the Jewish kids did. What happens when the target is a conflict out-group trial? Again, what we see here then is a bit more complicated. What we see is that when the target was a conflict out-group, then older children were more likely than younger children to choose a conflict out-group informant. In a sense, older children were more likely to choose to the epistemically correct choice than the younger children were. And what we also found, and this is again consistent with the previous one, the Jewish kindergartners were more likely than Arab kindergartners to choose a conflict out-group informant. In a sense, as you can see in this kind of trial, when the informants were an in-group or a conflict out-group, the Arab children avoided the conflict out-group, instead asking for the in-group informant. That is, another Arab informant. What happens in the advice question? Well, so here again, what you see here plotted is the valence of the in-group advice. So whether it was a positive or a negative, again, whether he said you should invite him to play with you or you should not invite him to play with you. And the complement, of course, is the disposition that the other informant produced. So what we see here is that across both ages and ethnicities, when the target was an in-group individual, if the alternative informant was an in-group and a neutral out-group, children followed the positive advice no matter who said it. So if the in-group said the positive advice, they followed his advice or her advice. When the in-group said the negative advice, they did not follow it. They followed the neutral out-group's positive advice. Interestingly, if the alternative informants were an in-group and a conflict out-group, then children followed the in-group no matter the valence of the advice. So again, in a trial like this, they stick to the in-group member and they don't follow the conflict out-group. What happened on conflict out-group trials? Well, what happens here is that if, again, the alternative informants were a neutral out-group and a conflict out-group, again, just children follow this positivity bias. They follow whoever said positive things about this. But when, again, the trials involved a conflict out-group, then we see a switch. Arab children still maintain this positivity bias, and they followed the positive advice no matter who said it. The Jewish children did the opposite. They followed the negative advice no matter who said it. So, running, in a study 3, switching gears a little bit, and we asked just more generally children's preferences for familiar people versus media as information sources on socially close versus distant matters. So here we tested, for now, only Jewish children. We're now running Palestinian Arabs as well, 3 age groups. And we tested them on seven topics divided into 3 categories. So we had them 3 questions about groups, Jews, Arabs, and Scots, intergroup relations, Jews and Arabs versus Russians, Ukrainians, and politics, Israeli elections versus American elections, being that Some of the topics were close to the child, they involved the in-group of the child, and the other topics did not involve the in-group of the child. And we wanted to see whether children have these preferences for who or what they turn to learn things about the topic, and why would they turn to that source. I'm not going to give you data on that second question, but we have it. So here's an example. Let's say you want to know something about Jews. To whom or what would you turn to learn things about Jews? And we spread these cards and we say, you can ask your parents, the TV, social media, teachers, siblings, friends, books, news, etc. So you have these 4 media sources and you have these 4 people sources for getting information about these different topics. And then again, as I said, we asked why. So what you see here is the percentage of times that the children chose the people versus the media sources on the different topics. I don't know if you can see that from the back, but on the left here is when the topic is Jews, and then Arabs, and then Scots. And what we see by and large is that when the topic is closest to them, it's about Jews. Again, these are Jewish participants. They want the people to tell them information. They want their parents, their teachers, and so on. 5th graders start moving away. Arabs also, kindergartens and 2nd graders, they want people to tell them information about it. 5th graders are still there. But when it's Scots, when it's something that is very distant from me, then we see this big switch. And 5th graders, then all of a sudden, they want to go to media. They don't trust, in a sense. They don't think that people know about Scots. And we know that this is the answer from their answers to why they chose media rather than people here. The same pattern happens for group relations, and the same pattern happens for politics. So to summarize, we see that overall in-group preference and some conflict out-group avoidance in children's choices of information and of informants. We see also some ethnic group differences on social matters, and it was interesting because on the one hand, Arab children showed stronger intergroup bias in informant preference and expertise, but Jewish children showed stronger intergroup bias in whether they accepted the informant's advice. We're puzzled with that, and we're wondering, we're following this up, is this related to minority-majority exposure to others? So the minority tends to be more exposed to majority sources than the other way around, everywhere in the world. Is it related to different motivations to engage with the outgroup? Again, minorities may have a larger interest in engaging with the majority than the other way around, and again, especially in the Israeli context. We also saw some interesting developmental changes. As we said, up to age 6, children seem to follow these parochial cues, but around age 7 or 8, they start relying more on epistemic cues. Again, is this the age of rationality? And finally, as many of us have already voiced, questions about why do we stick to the echo chambers? Why do these beliefs persist? Why do these preferences resist? Does it have to do with some trust heuristic, as some of us have talked about? Is it to avoid some threat to self-certainty, so the confirmation bias or the my-side bias, the idea that this is who I am, so I cannot now forgo and I have to stick to the people who represent myself, in a sense? Does it have to do with group loyalty, reputation, and so on? So I want to thank you. That's it.